Sembang Santai MITI Bicara Asean bersama saya Naila Huda, dan episod kali ini kami nak bincang pasal pelaburan hijau or green investment, specifically how to green the future and how green investments shape ASEAN's sustainable future. Sebab bila kita bercakap tentang masa depan ekonomi ASEAN, kita bukan nak lihat cabaran dia bukan pembangunan ekonomi semata-mata, tetapi bagaimana pembangunan tu boleh menjadi lebih mampan dan juga mesra alam. Because what is the point of economic development if we can't even inhabit Earth to reap the benefits after all of that? So we want to talk about green investments, pelaburan hijau, sektor-sektor dan industri hijau, dan bagaimana tenaga ataupun sektor hijau ini boleh menjadi pemangkin, a driver for ASEAN's economic growth, and what a green transition would actually look like in the region. And so untuk itu kita nak bersama dengan seorang tokoh yang tentunya tidak asing dalam dunia pelaburan dan strategi corporate. Kita bersama dengan Dato Rizal Rickman Ramli, Deputy President and Group Chief Executive of Permodalan Nasional Berhad or PNB. Good morning, Dato. How are you?
Yes, good morning. Very good.
Thank you so much for joining us on Sembang Santai MITI. I believe it's your first ever podcast, yeah?
Yes, it's my first podcast, so thank you for having me.
We're very, very honored to be here for your podcast debut, hopefully for many others. Unprecedented, it seems. But we want to have, of course, it's a very big conversation for us to have ESG and green investment. It really covers, it's a big scope, really. But I think we can start with a sort of bigger picture kind of question. How do you think ASEAN can balance development and sustainability? Is it something that can even coexist, or macam it's something of what they say it's a bit like an oxymoron, like they can't even mutually coexist? What are your thoughts?
I think it can coexist, but maybe the first thing to note is actually the starting position of ASEAN. As we all know, it's a large economy, the fifth largest economic bloc. Today, with the potential to be the fourth largest economic bloc, there's a lot of young population and a lot of growing industries here. Now, what I will say is, as we think about this growth and the requirement to further develop, the investments that is needed is going to be significant. It's in the trillions. And the amount of energy that we will then consume between now and the future will be quite a lot. So what's important is, if we continue to do the way we do, we will then require a lot of energy, a lot of resources. In the end, we might be living in an ASEAN that perhaps is richer and has grown up, but an ASEAN where the environmental and some of the social aspects are lacking. So my sense is, to answer your question, can this be achieved? The answer is yes, but it needs to be done in a very balanced manner. And this notion that we grow first and clean up later, I think we need to move to where we need to kind of grow together with sustainability. Now, let me talk about a couple of things in terms of what I think needs to happen. First and foremost, we need to ensure that ESG or sustainability contributes to positive outcomes for all. And I think today is maybe not the case, or not communicated clearly to the people. And a lot of people tend to view ESG as a cost that needs to be, or a regulation that needs to be met, but they don't quite yet see the benefit. So this one, we need to kind of ensure that the broader part of society feels the benefit and is engaged and feels included as we think about the policies. Second thing I will say, as we think of sustainability in ASEAN, is there's a lot of endowments within the different countries in ASEAN. You've got geothermal energy in Philippines, you've got solar wind in Vietnam, and hydro in places like Myanmar. How do we harness this collective strength so that as we develop and grow, we actually take advantage of the endowments we have within ASEAN and not just fully import a lot of the solution and technology? And as we do this, the economies and the companies within ASEAN benefit from being one integrated economy. The third point I would like to make is, it's important to show progress over perfection. And what I mean is, today a lot of countries have established a net zero commitment, or at least a carbon neutrality commitment. What is important is for these countries to show progress and show that they're making the incremental steps to get there. No need to just enforce strict rules and all that, but at least encourage this progress to happen across. So that's quite important, that You've got, developed countries like, Singapore, Malaysia trying to push that on, but you need to encourage the smaller ones and the least developed ones to kind of get along. And I think I'll talk more about this later because wearing my institutional capital hat, I think we need to leverage private capital in order to ensure that there's a balance between development and sustainability. And if you align the private capital well enough, we will get there. And last thing I'll say on this is we need collective leadership and governance. So ASEAN needs to strengthen institutional capacity and policy outcomes. So as we get there needs to be some form of uniformity of regulation, standards, and policies in order for all of us to be clear what we're getting into, in order to harness what I mentioned earlier, this one market benefit, so that at least if I do projects around ASEAN, I can integrate well into the broader market.
Yeah.
So the last thing I'll say is, in terms of an analogy, think of it as you're trying to upgrade your car. And ultimately, what you're trying to do is you're trying to get more horsepower, which is the growth, while not burning as much fuel, which is emission. So what you need to do is you need to have a better engine, which is efficiency. You need to have cleaner fuel, which is the renewable part. At the same time, you need to have good maintenance, which is the governance aspect, in order for us to deliver that.
No, that's very interesting. A lot of interesting points there, and I would say quite refreshing, because just in my perspective, my perception, my common presumption, I think, is that with government, with large bodies and corporations, they tend to view ESG and investments in green industries is more or less seen as a cost, as you said, and just seen as a mere checklist, right? Especially from a CSR perspective, it's what makes them look good. But I think, like you said, there is this slow shift in perception. Do you see that as well with industries and with funds and government?
Yeah. So maybe I'll share what we're doing at PNB. So maybe 2-3 years ago, we came out with a sustainability commitment. And for us, we wanted to make sure that it's not just for CSR, or is it for in terms of CSR perspective. We wanted to make sure that it goes to the heart of competitive advantage. So when you look at our commitments, it has to do with climate commitments, social commitments, and also governance commitments. And what I'll tell you is that as an investment house, we're doing it not just because it's good, but because we think in the long run it makes for good investment outcomes. So for example, if I own a building, and we own buildings around the world, and an example I'll give you is I own a building in London today, and if I don't refurbish and ensure that the performance is ESG compliant, the building will get stranded. So as an investment, I'll lose value there. And it makes sense for me to then upgrade that building to make it clean and so on, and then get the rent. I think that's how we think about it in Malaysia from a climate perspective. We are trying to get our companies to commit to net zero, to get on that pathway, because if they don't do it, they will have their business models will be outdated, and potentially our investments will be impacted. So we think that this is not just for the sake of doing good, but actually it makes sense for our unit holders for us to do this.
Talking about that shift in perception, that's in terms of maybe government, investment funds, and corporations. But what about SMEs? We want to look at ESG and how it's adopted across all segments of society, different layers of society. What do you think are perhaps some of the biggest barriers to ESG adoption, or how do you look at ESG being adopted in an inclusive manner? Because as you said, the slightly more developed countries in the region like Malaysia and Singapore are probably ahead of the game, but how do they make sure the neighboring countries that are slightly left behind in the ESG race can catch up, so that ESG adoption is a lot more inclusive regionally?
So if you think about how the evolution of ESG adoption is usually a bit top down. You kind of get governments to set certain standards. You get large corporates to adopt it, and I can tell you that's where the challenge is in trying to get the SMEs to adopt it. Because, for example, for us, we are trying to get to a certain to net zero portfolio by 2050. In terms of where the emissions are, it's all the big companies, right? And we need to then get the big companies to get on to a net zero pathway. But for them to deliver that, they need their supply chain to get there. And I can tell you today, it's challenging for the supply chain to get there because they are sometimes small, they are not, they don't have the expertise, and so on. That's why I think when we do this, it's not just a very strong mandate to say, get there or we will not buy from you, or we will divest you.
It can't be perfect, as you say.
It can't be perfect. It needs to be just, in a sense that we need to work with the supply chain. So we know that some companies will take time. As I mentioned earlier, it's progress over perfection. Some companies will take time, especially the SMEs. So for the SMEs itself, we will find a way to have a conversation around, okay, what does it take for you to get there? What investments you need? And if you need certainty of demand or longer term contracts for you to get there, we are willing to have that conversation. I think at the same time, this is where governments and policymakers need to come and think about, okay, if the world is moving towards that and big companies are going to adopt it, how do we get the SMEs to be prepared and ready? Do they need, education, retraining, grants, or some form of support in order to get there? Because I think private sector and large institutions, obviously they optimize for their returns and what they need. So I think the SMEs will need to be supported both from the bigger companies, but at the same time, policymakers and governments need to come in as well.
I mean, that's refreshing. That's in terms of the support that they can get. But in terms of your perspective as an investor, how important, how critical or crucial is it to see, or the investor sentiment as being a factor, to see green credentials as being that competitive advantage? Is it now a must?
So I would say it differs depending on where you are in the world. So going back to my example of real estate, so if you go to the UK or Europe and the US to some extent, it's seen as a must because the demand side requires it. So, and the demand side is because the tenants want a better credential building, or the city imposes certain standards, or the workforce, the young workforce in those markets actually want to see green credentials or sustainability practices within their work environment. Now, it's very different in some other markets. So I was just in Japan recently, and there the sustainability thing is not so big yet. It's not demanded by tenants, and the demand side is not there. So there, what happens is the foreign investors coming in, and their investors require them to have certain green practices. So they're trying to push that into the market. I think for Malaysia, I think what needs to be better articulated is, why is this green or sustainability move good for the population? And I can share with you as ASMB, as a PNB institution, sometimes when we publish that we are going into sustainability and signing up all these practices, some unit holders will comment on social media, say, hey, why are we doing this? Does it compromise my returns and so on? So there is a bit of, I would call it a social license to invest, meaning I'm trying to do this as an institution, and I think it's better for my long term, but the population is not yet convinced yet. And I think it will take a bit of education, engagement, and showing the benefits that, okay, by doing this, your investments are more resilient, more robust, and it's better off for the long term.
Because the ROI isn't as tangible, isn't it? But how do you think it's best for people to understand that? As you said, it's education, but could it help in sort of trying to understand ESG in the more simpler and relatable terms, in terms of in small changes, perhaps? I think that perception, as you said, it doesn't have to be perfect, right? Like small incremental changes, it helps. Like, do you think that kind of approach to awareness and education is already there? Is it? Do you think we need to move a little bit faster in, our adoption to ESG, so that we don't get left behind with Western counterparts? Perhaps?
I think first and foremost, we need to explain that ESG is not something that we inherit from the West, and they are kind of imposing their values and their standards. We're doing this because in the long run, it will make our economy, our businesses more resilient and robust. Now, to explain that, you need to kind of take a bit of a longer term view, and then show the evolution of what's happening in the Western markets, where companies that don't do this, investors lose interest, the valuation goes down. And you can see this in utility companies that they don't manage the transition well, and so on. But I think we need to speak with a language that is a lot simpler to understand, because I honestly just started looking at ESG maybe 2-3 years ago in a very meaningful way as an investor, and there's so much jargon, so much technicality for people to understand. So when you are sitting down and trying to understand all this, it's not simple to understand, right? And I think if you say, look, we're doing this so that long term your investments are safe, robust, we don't lose money along the way. And by the way, by doing this, we can make an ROI and preserve your capital in a lot better way. I think people will relate to it.
No, I think you mentioned a lot of interesting points there, and I think I agree with most of them. As you said, ESG doesn't have to be necessarily understood in Western terms or in the sort of Western context, right? There's a lot that can be localized, and I think that helps a lot with a more meaningful adoption to ESG. And as you said, there's a lot of jargon, and I just remember how Greta Thunberg talks about ESG and how, she goes to WEF and she's so disappointed because she sees this as just being like, government leaders and corporation leaders just being like, coming up with all this ESG jargon as a means of like trying to disguise what's actually going on, and just a means of CSR, really just greenwashing, as she says, as trying to make them look good. But we want to go back to sort of regional context, because we talk a lot about PNB, what PNB has done and how it's being adopted in Malaysia. But regionally, what do you think ASEAN is doing to promote green investment? Has there been a lot of progress in, say, maybe the past 5 years?
Yeah, so first and foremost, the need is significant. So as I mentioned, as we try to grow and develop ASEAN, the amount of investment that needs to go into clean energy and green is going to be quite significant. So the estimate from WF was something in the tune of $150 billion a year that needs to be spent in this space. And today the number that we're spending is a lot less. Now, the good news is that I think building blocks are in place to promote the investment. So, for example, there's already certain targets and frameworks. The ASEAN Plan of ASEAN Plan of Action for Energy Cooperation, which sets certain targets and so on. There's already some harmonization of taxonomy in terms of what is green, what is transitioning, and there's certain standards already in place. But what needs to happen is, as I mentioned earlier, was we need to unlock private capital in order to accelerate this. And one thing I'll mention about private capital is people think private capital is like, okay, they're just looking for high return and is all the same. But excuse me. But even if you look at private capital from the GLICs, so PNB, EPF, Khazanah, we're all looking for slightly different things. So when I look at investing into green and transitioning into the region, PNB, my uni holders want a yield, meaning they need a dividend every year. So I'm less reluctant to do development projects which take a long term to gestate. So I'm looking for projects which are more mature, there's cash flow, so that I can pay that annual dividend. Khazanah maybe is a bit different. They might be willing to do more development type aspects. So one thing to recognize is different investors look for different things. So within ASEAN, there needs to be a portfolio of things that, okay, if you're looking for development type returns, which is essentially 15 to 20% returns, there are projects for that. But if you're looking for returns which are more safe and so on, like 10% or 8 to 10% yield, there's also there. That's one thing. Second thing I'll say is that capital is global. So we need to kind of benchmark our returns here versus what I can get in OECD countries. So a development project in OECD countries, I can probably get 15 to 20% returns. So if there's a project here with giving me 15 to 20% return, that probably doesn't it's not as attractive because I take additional risk here around currency, around market risk and so on. So we need to figure out how to make sure that the returns commensurate with the risks that I take within ASEAN. And that's where I think blended finance comes in, because for us, we recognize that it's important to have capital here. At the same time, we recognize that capital to invest into the region, you kind of need enhanced return because of the risk that a lot of companies and institutional investors are taking. So what that means is that blended finance has to come in order to try to either mitigate the downside or enhance the upside.
That's interesting, but I want to look at the next few years to come, perhaps in the next 5 or 10 years. How do you see the green transition in ASEAN becoming more just, or maybe not? We're seeing issues of economic inequality, wealth inequality. The disparity is still quite large. Do you think that will also reflect in the transition to becoming more green in the region?
I think when we talk about just transition, what we're really meaning is that the shift towards a cleaner economy is fair and equitable and inclusive. So what that ultimately means is that people generally have universal access to affordable and clean energy. There is support in sectors that will get impacted by this transition. So there's the support in terms of retraining, reskilling of workforce, and vulnerable communities are kind of supported along this journey. Now, as an institutional investor, and just to put things in context, we're also trying to manage our portfolio and investments to get to net zero or a sustainable outcome in a just manner. So what that means is that we cannot just go to a company and say, hey, please get there, otherwise I'll divest you.
Yeah.
And ultimately what we're trying to do is we're trying to get companies to get on this journey. And the way we do it is we write engagement letters, we articulate why is this important, and so on. And more importantly is we say, look, if you need funding and investments in order to change your business models, in order to get there, we are willing to do that. So for PNB, we have both the carrot and the stick in order to manage the just transition. The carrot is we have this 10 billion green and transitioning fund that we want to deploy and help companies manage this transition period. But the stick are things like our voting guidelines, our shareholder letters, and so on, where we kind of put quote unquote pressure companies in order to get on this path, because we believe that getting on this path is important. And the way it is just is that we just don't look at very narrowly just climate. We look at a broader set of things. We look at things like labor rights, living wage, so that when we kind of nudge companies to adopt green or get on a sustainability pathway, we then make sure that the workers and the workforce are supported. The labor that they use are sustainable, and there's living wage. So we actually, together with a lot of the other GLICs under the Gear Up initiative, we're now trying to push living wage as a concept within the GLIC company. And the number that we use is we want a living wage of 3,100. That's the number we got from. We use the Belanjawanku number. But we let each company decide, what's the appropriate figure and the appropriate pathway. What we want is they need to establish a policy and a commitment and take time to get there. So at the end of it, the transition becomes just because companies are stronger and more robust from a business model. Employees in those companies feel the benefit because there is things like living wage, and supply chain, because of labor rights, feel that, okay, companies are not just squeezing returns out of the supply chain in order to get to their transition goals.
No, I think that's interesting to look at ESG beyond just becoming green and more environmentally friendly. It really encompasses a lot of things, like the living wage. And I think that's in terms that is a lot more understandable and a lot more enjoyable for all layers. But when you talk about the carrot and stick, I'm curious, which do you think, or in your observation, which has been more effective, or there should be a sort of a fine balance between the two approaches?
So I think it goes hand in hand together, because the stick is quite useful, and when used appropriately, actually the outcomes can be quite strong. Especially because PNB, we own significant stakes in a lot of companies. So and the companies we own 50% or more, if we said we want to vote down a chairman of a company because they didn't meet certain diversity targets or ESG commitment targets, it is binding. Meaning it's not just a signal that we're unhappy, but it is binding because 50% or more the resolution counts. But in other places where I guess we don't have a significant or a high shareholding, I think the signaling mechanism is important, and the way we do it is not just saying we vote no to the resolution or certain things that the company is doing, but we engage them because they need to understand where we're coming from, and at the same time we need to also understand what's the reservation. If they say, look, by doing this, and this is a real example where we wanted to adopt living wage across.
Yeah.
For some companies, it's not an expensive thing to do because they're already paying quite well. But for other companies, the cost is going to be quite prohibitive.
Yeah.
So for them, for that, we kind of have a discussion on, okay, if it's prohibitive, what do you need to do to get there over what time period? If they say I need 5 years to get there and this is what's requirement, we will work with them for that.
Now we are coming towards the end, but I just want to quickly hear you out on some of your wish lists, perhaps. If you were to see ESG adopted, if you were to see a more green, inclusive, sustainable future for ASEAN, what are some of your wish lists that you'd like to see in the next perhaps 5-10 years?
Firstly, we need to recognize that this is good for ASEAN and good for society and good for companies. So, and that needs to be communicated better in terms of ESG. As I said, it's going to be beneficial for everyone. Number two is we also have to recognize that this is a multi-decade agenda, and we need to approach it that way, meaning allow countries maybe some time and pace in order to deliver on that. And three is integration within ASEAN is going to unlock this, because if every country is doing their own thing and there's not optimization across, then you have countries that will benefit, some countries will do. So you need to have greater integration in order for the benefits to be felt across more effectively.
Thank you so much. I think you've shared quite a lot of interesting points, and very refreshing, I think, to hear your take on ESG and this more, this greener, sustainable future for ASEAN, and how we can get closer to that goal. Thank you so much, Dato, for joining us today. That is all on Sembang Santai MITI Bicara ASEAN on this episode, talking about greening the future, how green investments shape ASEAN's sustainable future. That is all on this episode. With me, Naila Huda. We'll catch you another time.